What is happening, guys? My name is Jamie and today we are doing albums we have changed our mind on. Allow me to introduce our special guest on the channel. Well, this time it's not Quest for Metal for the first fucking time. It is none other than Robert from the Metal Meltdown. Take it away, Robert.
Good morning, metalheads of the internet. My name is Robert Walton and I am the host of the Metal Meltdown right here on YouTube. And today, Jamie has asked me to tell you about some albums that I've changed my mind on over the years. Maybe I loved them at first, maybe I hated them at first, maybe I didn't really know how I felt about them at first. Whatever the case, I have since changed my mind on the matter. There's no particular ranking for me, no worst to best, no best to worst. I'm starting with the most recently released album on my list, and we're backtracking from there.
Thank you, the Metal Meltdown. We do appreciate your time. And first of all, I'm going to let you kick it off with your first album.
That first album in question being quite recent, in fact. It was released earlier this year. It is Ordinary Man from the one and only Ozzy Osbourne. When this album came out back in February, I initially dismissed it as being very mediocre and overproduced. I felt that people were giving the album a pass simply because it had Ozzy's name attached to it, simply because it was his first solo album in a while. I felt as if it was a very dry and tepid record, and while I appreciated some contributions from Slash and Elton John and Andrew Watt and many more, ultimately the album suffered because the main star himself, Ozzy Osbourne, just didn't really sound that great to me. And just so we're clear, I would still argue now that he is the weakest link on that record. Easily some of the most processed, robotic, and overproduced vocals I've ever heard on an album, let alone an Ozzy album. But then something interesting happened. I found myself re-listening to this album with my father, a gentleman who remembers buying classic Black Sabbath on vinyl and has seen Ozzy Osbourne plenty of times over the years. And he responded to this album with incredible joy. I don't think there's a single moment on this album where he didn't have a big, fat, stupid smile on his face. He wasn't concerning himself with the finer details of the production value or the sound mix or the grand concept and aesthetic of Ordinary Man. He was just enjoying the album and enjoying that Ozzy was happy and relatively healthy and finally getting himself back out there after multiple big-time health scares. To my surprise, I even found him sniffling a little bit during the power ballad duet, Ordinary Man. Similarly to how Ozzy and Elton reflect on their lives of controversy and rock and roll infamy on that track, my father in that moment kind of reflected on his own life, discovering hard rock, heavy metal, and punk rock, and marrying my mom, and having me, and traveling the country, and doing all the fucking crazy, weird bullshit that we did, and it was a genuinely touching kind of moment. And since that little session, I've come to greatly appreciate so much of what is on this record. Does the album still have some issues? Absolutely, but I suppose in the grand scheme of things, they don't really matter, because those things at this point cannot detract from the experience I had listening to this album with my dad. Nor can they detract from the undeniable dedication of the Prince of Darkness himself, Ozzy Osbourne. Plus, straight to hell, legit kind of a banger. Legit kind of a banger.
Wow, Ozzy Osbourne, Ordinary Man. You know what? I thoroughly enjoyed that album. I think it was solid, but I'm so glad you actually enjoy it now. I'm so glad it finally connected with you. It's such a great album, in my opinion. I really love it. I think it's really fun. And his vocals, yeah, at times they do sound robotic, but I think it works well on this album. Okay, so first up, my album that I hated, but I absolutely love now, is none other than Cannibal Corpse Kill. When I first heard this album, I thought this was noise. It was an absolute chaotic mess, and honestly, I just couldn't believe. I still think this is one of the heaviest albums ever, in my opinion, because I know my mate said listen to Kill, so I listened to Kill and I thought it was a total racket, it was total piece of shit, and I thought it was just the worst thing I've ever heard in my life. You know what, I wasn't a really big fan of Cannibal Corpse back then, but I exposed myself to more Cannibal Corpse, and I started to really enjoy this album. Like The Time to Kill Is Now, I will Make Them Suffer, and you got 5 Nails Through the Neck. Absolutely amazing song. The guitar work, the chaotic moments. I just really started to dig chaotic moments, and this is how I got into bands such as Anal Nathrak through Cannibal Corpse, because I just absolutely adored the chaos, especially through the Kill. And although I stand by this is probably one of the most heaviest albums of all time, still holds that structural approach on this album, and that's why I really adore this album now. The Kill would be up there to be one of my favorite albums by Cannibal Corpse. I just love how chaotic and how it's probably one of the most heaviest albums by them. It's so damn good, this album. I don't know why I hated it at first, because I wasn't really gravitating towards death metal back then. But yeah, Cannibal Corpse is fantastic now, and so is the album Kill.
Next up, Nightmare Logic, the sophomore album from American thrash metal crew Power Trip. When this album first came out, for whatever reason, it just did not stick with me one fucking bit. I felt that it was a very generic, cliched, and stereotypical thrash record that did absolutely nothing to advance the genre and was simply riding off the coattails of nostalgia. Put very simply, the way I saw it, people only liked this album because it sounded like an old-school thrash metal record, not because it was legitimately well-written, produced, or performed. Boy, was I a fucking idiot. To be fair, I don't think anyone would argue that Nightmare Logic is a particularly progressive record, even by thrash metal standards, lyrically, musically, conceptually. But in that moment, I did seem to have forgotten a very basic rule of thrash metal. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. And Nightmare Logic ain't fucking broke. Not one fucking bit. An extremely tight, entertaining, razor-sharp collection of pure thrash metal fury, with incredible guitar solos, incredible percussion, incredible headbanging choruses, and some of the meanest riffs that thrash metal has heard in a while. I got no issue saying it. I was an absolute moron to think for even a second that Power Trip were somehow unworthy of the praise and success lavished upon that album. And anyone who, for whatever reason, feels otherwise, take some advice from a veteran here, pull that fucking stick out of your ass.
Good fucking pick. Well, Metal Meltdown, my next pick is none other than a latest album. It's Caligula's Horse and the album Rise Radiant. This album, when I first heard this album, I thought this was generic prog metal. If it wasn't for Quest for Metal telling me to listen to it again, I probably would be saying the same thing. It's just generic prog metal. One particular time on a rainy sort of day, I started to really enjoy this album for some reason. I decided to turn it on and listen to it. I think this is such a solid album, it really is. I don't know, and even I put a bad review out for this album as well earlier this year, and I don't know why I did, but I just really enjoyed this album. Now, love the song The Tempest, Slow Violence, Valkyrie, and The Ascent is such an amazing song as well. The beautiful guitar licks throughout this album, not to mention his vocals are so damn fucking good. I remember I saw Caligula's Horse live last year, opening for Nea Blascaris. And yeah, I really enjoyed Caligula's Horse. And this album to me was a gateway to their music. It was, because I really enjoy most of their albums now. Actually, I enjoy all of the albums. I just love how heavy they are. They just remind me of Dream Theater. Now, no, Robert doesn't like Dream Theater, which is okay. It's okay. We all respect each other's opinions. But I just feel Caligula's Horse just reminds me of bands such as Dream Theater. It's just an amazing album. It's one of the best prog metal albums of the year, in my opinion. I just really love every single moment. There are soft parts, acoustic parts, heavy parts, but really every single song just flows together so damn well. And I absolutely adore it. And Caligula's Horse Rise Radiant is sitting here.
Next up we have Magma from Gojira, and this is kind of an interesting scenario because I never outright disliked this album. I just wasn't entirely sold on what was happening on the album. Like, my initial attitude was just kind of like, okay, it's Gojira, and now they have all these sappy post-metal parts. Okay, whatever, sure, I can dig it, I can vibe with it, whatever, who cares? And I never really bothered to put much thought into it. I never really bothered trying to connect any of the dots that were so very clearly placed in front of me. Why is that exactly? I don't know. Maybe that stick was just too far up my fucking ass. I don't really have a great answer for you. But I can tell you that it didn't take very long for me to finally start connecting those dots. And when I did, this album blossomed into something truly fucking beautiful for me. Suddenly, its intricate movements made sense. Its emotional vulnerability and flexibility and transparency made sense. Its earth-shattering riffs, combined with its melodrama, with its atmosphere, made so much sense. As Mario and Joe Duplantis consistently across the record utilize and adapt personal loss into some of their most powerful material ever. A truly remarkable record. Not lying one bit. If we were to review this thing, like do a full review right now, this is the kind of album that would get a fucking 5 out of 5 from me. This is a fucking amazing record, and I was a fool to simply dismiss it as, yeah, Gojira doing post-metal, I guess that's cool, yeah. It's way fucking bigger and heavier than that, and if you don't already know that for yourself, now you do. Go listen to Magma with a fucking box of tissues and a cold bottle of booze.
Alright, so yeah, that's a pretty interesting pick, isn't it? Before I continue, wish the Metal Meltdown a happy birthday from all of us. I believe it is his birthday, so wish him a happy birthday. Next up is Insomnium, Heart Like a Grave. 2019, I wasn't really a big Insomnium fan. I started to really get into Insomnium this year, to be honest. And after I listened to the album, I thought the album was fucking fantastic. I think I listened to Across the Dark, which is an amazing album. I said, holy shit, this band's finally gravitating towards me. It's finally clicking to me. So when I first heard Heart Like a Grave, I thought it was just melodic doom nonsense. I just didn't really enjoy it. Nothing really clicked to me. It was really slow melodic death, and I just did not like it. Valediction was horrible in my opinion. Pale Morning Star was terrible. Heart Like a Grave was shocking. Corellia was a really cheesy instrumental, and I thought it was a terrible album, but everyone was saying, oh, it's the best, it's one of the best Insomnium albums. I was like, stick a breadstick up your ass, mate. No, it isn't. And Insomnium's the worst fucking band I've ever heard. Well, I gotta tell you, Insomnium really grew on me. I exposed myself to these albums, exposed myself to this particular album, Heart Like a Grave. Holy shit, I fell in love with it. There are moments that Rob said about how albums click to you, especially when he was listening to Ozzy Osbourne with his father, how it just clicked to him, how he saw his father starting to enjoy that album. This is very similar, it really is, except it's by myself. This album really clicked to me, it did. At one particular day, I don't know, it must have been a pretty rainy, terrible, depressing day, but oh yeah, this album really reminded me of Swallow the Sun. It did, and I absolutely started to adore it. I love the doomy elements throughout this album. Valediction is such a beautiful song. The Offering is one of my favorite songs off the album. Heart Like a Grave is so damn good. Yeah, so this album really clicked to me, and I love it now. I really love it, where initially I hated it. Heart Like a Grave by Insomnium is actually a fantastic fucking album. I wish I could punch my past self in the face to say, hey, look, you dickhead, this is a great fucking album.
Next up, we have Khaos Legions from Arch Enemy, and guess what, ladies and gentlemen? We've officially reached the point in my part of this video where I'm no longer talking about albums I have grown to appreciate. I actually loved this album when it initially came out. At the time, I was pretty much at the end of high school, and I wasn't really a huge fan of a lot of extreme music, let alone death metal. Arch Enemy, for a while, seemed to be the exception because it was a lot more anthemic and a lot better produced than records I had come to know from Cannibal Corpse, Obituary, Morbid Angel, and even some more mainstream bands that I simply thought were death metal because of their aggressive sound, like Slayer and Slipknot. And before the genre police come in here and lose their minds with like, Slayer and Slipknot aren't death metal. I know they're not death metal. I was a teenager. Give a guy a fucking break. As I've grown older and I've continued to explore heavy metal and the broader spectrums of extreme music, not only have I come to, well, obviously learn more about these genres, but I've come to really kind of dislike Arch Enemy and this particular album from them. What initially felt so fresh and inspired to me back in 2011 now feels kind of dry, kind of pedantic, kind of repetitive to me. I have since learned that there are tons of bands doing pretty much exactly what Arch Enemy is doing, and frankly doing it a lot better. I'll definitely give Arch Enemy and this album a little bit of credit. They kind of did pave the way for me to learn more about heavy metal and extreme music, and hell, I'll do you one better, Arch Enemy. You're a pretty good fucking live band too. Saw them last year opening for Amon Amarth at the Rebel nightclub here in Toronto, and it was a pretty fucking great show, to be honest with you. But nowadays, this particular album just doesn't really do anything for me. It is very silly, very cheesy, and just, frankly, not that interesting anymore. Sorry, guys.
Since this is my video and I invited Rob to collab with me, I actually got 2 albums that I need to explain to you. That albums that I absolutely loved at first, and now albums that I don't like at all. So this is Korn, by the way. Korn. We're going to See You on the Other Side. Yep, See You on the Other Side. You know what? This album is it's very disappointing. It really is. When I first heard it, I absolutely adored it. I loved every single song, like Twisted Transistor, Politics, Hypocrites, Tenor or Two-Way. I love song, Open Up, Coming Undone, Getting Off, Liar, For No One. And then you got Tearjerker, Seen It All. So many great songs on this album. Yeah, so many great songs. Yeah. Well, I heard it again earlier this year, and yeah, I hated the album. And I didn't understand why everyone was just shitting on this album, but now I understand why, because the production's not very good. Jonathan Davis's vocals are okay on this, but it's just really such a weird album, and I fucking adored this album as well. I don't know what changed for me with this album, but now I can't stand this album. I cannot stand this album. And that's why it's on this list. Korn, I absolutely adored this album. One's Path of Totality. I actually got the special edition of Korn as well. That's how much I loved this album, and I actually despise it now. I actually despise this album. I suppose Narcissistic Cannibals a good song, along with Get Up is a good song, and Way Too Far, Bleeding Out, and then you got Fuels the Comedy, which is the bonus track, which I fucking hate. Yeah, this album is a very disappointing album. It's Path of Shitality by Korn. An album I used to love, now I hate. So I changed my mind on this one as well. You're next, Robert.
And that brings us now to my final album, and it's a weird one. Not just for this video, but in general. We're talking about Chinese Democracy from Guns N' Roses. Believe it or not, and no pun intended here, there was a time when I genuinely kind of loved this album and quite aggressively defended it. I defended the incredibly elaborate progressive songwriting. I defended the production value and most of the performances on the album, and I even defended Axl Rose himself and his incredibly obsessive desire to complete this album by himself over the course of like 14 fucking years. And while I would argue that this album is probably better than most would want to give it credit for, I think that most of the reason why I loved this album so much back in 2009 was simply because I was a die-hard Guns N' Roses fan. Still am, for the record, but now I'm also an adult, and I recognize that Chinese Democracy, while not a truly awful record, is extremely problematic. There are far too many raisins in what is supposed to be a chocolate chip cookie, if you catch my drift. Not only is the album inherently, inarguably so fucking pretentious and overproduced, it completely lacks the essence of what made Guns N' Roses who they are. The sleaze, the dirt, the grit, the blood, the venom, the authenticity, and the party-hard spirit. None of that was anywhere to be found on this record. It seems to have been completely switched out in favor of a very over-the-top sound that seems to mishmash the piano-driven ballad rock of Elton John with the more complex and off-putting industrial rock of Nine Inch Nails. I will admit that I still admire how inherently ambitious the album is as a result. I mean, I can't really think of any other rock albums that look or sound anything like Chinese Democracy. And I'll even give the band some extra credit by saying that, despite my concerns, I do think Chinese Democracy does still have some legitimately really great fucking songs. The tracks I'm Sorry and This I Love in particular, I would rank among Guns N' Roses' best songs ever. But even with that in mind, at the end of the day, this album is far too big for its own good. And it is very clear to me, especially now that I know the history of what went into Chinese Democracy, that I should have never defended this album as passionately as I did when I was a stupid little fucking teenager who didn't know any better.
So now we go on to my final pick, the album that I used to love, and now I sort of hate. It is Five Finger Death Punch and Justice for None. Alright, so yeah, when this came out, I loved this album. I just loved how different this album was from any Five Finger Death Punch album, because I wasn't really a big fan of Gotcha 6, and I thought it was a little bit of an improvement. And I thought every single song was a fucking banger. You had Trouble, Fake, Top of the World, Champagne, that fucking chorus was amazing. Fire in the Hole, I Refuse. When the Seasons Change, yeah, you had some pretty good songs. In my opinion, back in the day, back 2 years ago, I thought this album was like a 10 out of 10. But as I was exploring more music, as I was exploring more technicality, when I explored Dream Theater, Hello, and other progressive metal bands out there, I turned this on again. I turned Five Finger Death Punch and Justice for None on again. And I said, holy shit, this is a whole lot of tripe. This is really bad. How can I actually like this? This is fucking shit. And you know what? I stand by my opinion. This is one of the shittiest Five Finger Death Punch albums. I much prefer the other Five Finger Death Punch albums. But yeah, and Justice for None is a total crock. It really is. I don't mind F8. F8's a good album, but this album is pretty disappointing in my opinion. And an album that I absolutely used to love, I changed my mind on it. I changed my mind on it because the riffs were repetitive, the solos were repetitive, everything was just repetitive on this album, and it was the same old fucking sound over and over again with a mix of southern vibes. That's all. So disappointing album. Very disappointing album by Five Finger Death Punch. And yeah, that's the album I changed my mind on.
And that's it for me, I guess. This was cool. Always wanted an opportunity to talk about Chinese Democracy, because it's a very interesting record to talk about. So thank you, Jamie. If you liked what I said and you're not subscribed to my channel and you want to hear more, may I recommend you subscribe? I don't know, that'd be pretty cool, I guess. I mean, you do what you want. You're an adult. You do what you want, but I think it'd be pretty cool. It would be pretty cool. Back to you, Jamie, and thanks again.
Thank you for collabing with me. And guys, comment below the albums you have changed your mind on in the comments below. So the link will be in the description for the Metal Meltdown's channel down below. Go subscribe to him, check out his channel. So yeah, thank you guys for watching, and I will see you in the next one.